The video feed appeared on every screen across Earth and its colonies with crystal clarity. Ambassador Richard Hayes stood in the massive throne room of the Draxian Empire, wearing his formal diplomatic uniform. His gray hair was neatly combed and his expression was calm as he addressed the alien emperor seated before him. Behind Richard stood his young assistant Linda Morris, who held a data tablet containing the trade proposals they had traveled 3 months to deliver. The throne room was enormous with walls that seemed to glow with an inner light, and dozens of alien species watched from elevated galleries. Richard had been a diplomat for 23 years, and had negotiated with hostile governments before, but never had he felt such tension in the air. Emperor Vaxthor sat on his crystalline throne looking down at the human ambassador with forearms folded across his chest. The Draxians were tall beings with blue-scaled skin and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Their empire controlled 40 star systems, and they had made it very clear since first contact that they viewed humanity as primitive newcomers who should be grateful for any attention at all. Richard had spent weeks trying to arrange this meeting, and had finally been granted an audience to discuss mining rights in a system both species claimed. The resources there could power Earth's colonies for decades, and provide the Draxians with materials they needed for their expanding fleet. It should have been a simple negotiation where both sides benefited. Richard spoke clearly, and his words were translated by the devices worn by everyone in the chamber. He explained how human mining technology could extract resources the Draxians could not reach, and how the profits could be shared equally. He talked about building trust between their species and creating a foundation for future cooperation. Linda occasionally handed him documents or pulled up displays showing projected yields and distribution models. Everything was professional and cordial on the human side. The Draxians, however, showed no interest in the proposal, and several of the observers in the galleries made sounds that the translation devices could not interpret but which sounded distinctly mocking. Emperor Vaxthor finally raised one hand for silence. His voice came through the translators as deep and resonant, but with an edge that made Richard's spine stiffen. The Emperor said that humanity presumed too much and that species so young had no right to claim systems that the Draxian Empire had known about for thousands of years. Richard began to respond with another carefully prepared argument about international space law and the rights of exploration, but Vaxthor cut him off with a sharp gesture. The Emperor stood and his forearms spread wide in what human experts had thought was a welcoming gesture but now seemed more like a predator displaying its reach. What happened next occurred so fast that most viewers watching the live feed could barely process it. Vaxthor made a single downward motion with his primary right hand. 2 massive Draxian guards who had been standing motionless by the wall suddenly moved with terrible speed. Richard turned at the sound of their approach and his eyes went wide. He raised his hands not in defense but in a gesture of peace and confusion. The ceremonial blade one guard carried was nearly 2 meters long and curved with symbols etched along its length. The guard swung once and the blade passed through Richard's neck with barely any resistance. The ambassador's body collapsed and his head rolled across the polished floor, leaving a trail that looked black under the strange lighting. Linda's scream cut through the chamber like a siren. She dropped her tablet and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The second guard was already moving toward her. She fumbled for the emergency beacon on her belt and managed to activate it before the guard reached her. The feed showed her falling, and then the camera angle shifted as whoever was recording the session moved to capture the full scene. The last image transmitted back to Earth was of Emperor Vaxthor, standing over the bodies with his forearms raised high, while the alien observers in the galleries made sounds that might have been cheers or approval. Then the transmission ended and screens across human space went dark. In the military command center deep beneath Geneva, the silence was absolute. Fleet Admiral John Carter sat frozen in his chair, staring at the now blank screen. Around him, 30 officers and government officials seemed unable to move or speak. The admiral was a career military man who had fought in the border skirmishes with pirates and had seen death before, but never anything like this. Never an execution during a diplomatic mission. Never such casual brutality directed at people who came in peace. General Patricia Brooks was the first to find her voice, and it came out as barely a whisper. She said they had killed him and then repeated it louder. They had murdered Earth's ambassador during a peace negotiation. The room erupted into chaos as everyone began talking at once. Some demanded immediate military action while others urged caution. Someone suggested contacting the other alien governments to see if any would support sanctions. Another voice said they should recall all human diplomats from alien worlds immediately before more were killed. President Karen White entered the command center and the voices fell silent. She was a tall woman with dark hair, and she had been president for only 2 years, but had faced more crises than most leaders faced in a lifetime. She had personally selected Richard Hayes for this mission because he was the best they had, and because she believed his calm demeanor and experience could break through Draxian arrogance. She had spoken to his wife the day before he left and promised her that Richard would return safely. Now she would have to call that woman and explain that her husband had been beheaded on camera for trying to make peace. The president's voice was quiet, but everyone in the room heard every word. She told them to get the Security Council assembled and to contact every fleet commander in human space. She wanted to know if anyone on the diplomatic mission had survived, though she already knew the answer. In the hours that followed, reports came in confirming that Linda Morris had died within minutes of the attack. The emergency beacon she activated had transmitted just long enough to verify both deaths before being destroyed. The Draxian Empire sent no apology and no explanation. Instead, they broadcast a message on all frequencies stating that humanity's proposal had been answered in the appropriate manner and that Earth should remember its place in the galactic order. Admiral Carter read the Draxian message 3 times, trying to understand the mentality behind it. They were not just refusing the trade agreement, but actively insulting humanity and daring them to respond. It was clear the Draxians believed Earth would do nothing because humanity was outnumbered and outgunned. The Draxian military had over 300 warships, while Earth could barely field 40. Every tactical analysis said that fighting them would be suicide. But as Carter looked around the command center at the young faces of men and women who had watched their ambassador murdered, he realized that some things mattered more than tactical analysis. President White called an emergency session of the Terran Alliance Council to convene within 6 hours. Every member government from Earth to the Mars colonies to the outer settlements would have to vote on what came next. As the command center began to empty, Carter remained in his chair staring at the frozen image on the screen. Someone had captured Richard's face in the moment before the blade fell, and it showed confusion more than fear. The ambassador had not believed even then that they would really kill him. He had trusted in the sanctity of diplomatic immunity and the basic rules that governed civilized species. That trust had been answered with steel and blood. The Admiral knew what he would recommend in the coming meetings. He knew what Earth's response had to be, even if it meant risking everything humanity had built among the stars. The Draxians had made a fatal mistake, and Carter intended to make them understand exactly how fatal it was. They had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping since Earth unified and turned its eyes to space. They had reminded humans what it meant to be pushed too far, and they were about to learn what humanity looked like when it stopped being diplomatic and started being dangerous. The emergency session of the Terran Alliance Council lasted 17 hours without break. Representatives from every human colony and settlement joined via holographic link, creating a chamber filled with flickering images of angry and frightened faces. President Karen White stood at the center podium with dark circles under her eyes, but her back straight and her voice unwavering. Behind her, massive screens displayed Richard Hayes throughout his career, shaking hands with alien dignitaries, signing treaties, giving speeches at universities. Next to those images played the final moments of his life on an endless loop so that no one in the chamber could forget why they were there. The president began by stating the facts without emotion. Earth's senior ambassador and his assistant had been executed during a sanctioned diplomatic mission. The Draxian Empire had offered no justification and had instead broadcast messages suggesting humanity deserved this treatment. Every human in space was now at risk because the galaxy had been shown that killing human diplomats carried no consequences. She paused and let the weight of that reality set over the room before continuing. The question before the council was simple, but the answer would define humanity's future among the stars. Would they accept this atrocity or would they respond? Council member Gregory Lang represented the Mars colonies, and he was the first to speak in opposition to military action. He stood and his hologram flickered as he pointed out that Earth had 42 operational warships, while the Draxian Empire commanded over 300. A military response would unite other alien empires against humanity out of fear, and Earth would face annihilation from multiple fronts. He argued that economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation would be more effective in the long term and would not risk human extinction. Several other council members nodded in agreement, and one representative from the Neptune stations added that humanity had survived by being smart, not by being aggressive. Admiral John Carter had been standing silently against the wall, but now he stepped forward and his boots echoed in the chamber. He was not a member of the council, but had been invited to provide military perspective. His uniform was immaculate despite the long hours, and his gray eyes swept across the assembled representatives. He asked them what alternative they proposed, and his voice carried a challenge. Should Earth accept that ambassadors could be murdered during peace talks? Should they tell every human citizen that their lives meant nothing beyond Earth's borders? Should they explain to Richard Hayes's wife that her husband's death was acceptable because fighting back was too dangerous, Senator? Helen Parker from the Jupiter colonies spoke up, saying that Admiral Carter was appealing to emotion rather than logic. She brought up detailed projections showing that even if humanity won initial battles, the Draxian Empire could replace losses faster than Earth could build new ships. A prolonged war would devastate human colonies and set back expansion by decades. She insisted that survival required accepting bitter truths and that sometimes retreat was wiser than revenge. The chamber erupted in argument, with representatives shouting over each other about honor versus pragmatism and justice versus survival. President White called for order, and the room gradually quieted. She said she had consulted with every allied alien government in the past 12 hours. The Kepler Federation expressed horror at the execution, but refused to risk war with the Draxians. The Centauri Republic offered sympathetic words, but no material support. Two smaller governments said privately they understood Earth's position, but could not be seen supporting aggression against an established empire. Humanity stood completely alone, and no help was coming from any direction. She let that information hang in the air before asking the question that mattered most. Who were humans going to be in this moment? Would they accept that their people could be killed without consequence, or would they show the galaxy that human life had value worth fighting? For Dr. Martin Cole had been Earth's chief scientist for 6 years, and he now activated a series of technical displays. He said that if humanity chose to respond, it had to be decisive and overwhelming. Half measures would only invite further aggression and make Earth look weak and desperate. The Draxians had to understand the true cost of what they had done. He brought up tactical maps showing the Draxian Empire's vast territory, and noted that their forces were spread thin, maintaining control over 40 systems. Their throne world Draxia Prime was heavily defended, but the Draxians would never expect a direct strike there, because it seemed too bold and too suicidal. That assumption was their weakness. Gregory Lang stood again, and his face was red with anger. He asked if they were seriously discussing an attack on the Draxian homeworld, and called it absolute madness. Hitting their capital would guarantee total war, and the destruction of everything humanity had built. Other voices joined his in protest, saying that such an attack would make Earth the aggressor, and would justify any retaliation the Draxians chose. The argument went back and forth for hours with the chamber, divided almost evenly between those who wanted action and those who counseled restraint. Admiral Carter finally spoke again, and this time his voice was softer but somehow more forceful. He said they were not talking about conquest or territory. They were talking about sending a message that would be heard across the entire galaxy. If humanity did nothing, then every aggressive empire would see Earth as easy prey. Human diplomats, merchants, and colonists would be vulnerable everywhere they went. But if Earth struck back hard enough and publicly enough, then other species would think twice before harming humans. He acknowledged the risks and admitted that casualties would be heavy and defeat was possible. But he insisted that some things were worth the risk, because the alternative was living in fear forever. President White let the debate continue until voices grew hoarse and arguments became repetitive. Finally, she called for a vote. The resolution was specific and narrow. Earth would not declare war but would authorize a military strike against Draxia Prime in response to the murder of Ambassador Hayes and Assistant Morris. Any military personnel who participated would be volunteers, and no one would be ordered to risk their life. The strike would be limited in scope, with the goal of demonstrating Earth's ability to reach anyone who harmed its people. If successful, the operation would be followed by demands for justice and reparations. If it failed, then humanity would face whatever consequences came. The vote took 2 hours as each representative consulted with their constituents. When the final tally came in, the resolution passed by a margin of 7 votes. It was not the overwhelming mandate some had hoped for, but it was enough. President White looked around the chamber at faces showing relief, fear, anger, and determination. She said that history would judge whether they had made the right choice, but that living with the murder of their ambassador was not an option she could accept. Earth would strike back, and the galaxy would learn that humanity could be pushed but not broken. Within 24 hours, the call went out across human space on every frequency. Volunteers were needed for a military operation of vital importance. No details were provided about the target or the odds, but everyone knew what it was about. The response shocked even the most optimistic planners. Applications flooded in from every colony and station. Active military personnel volunteered in such numbers that entire ships had full crews within hours. Reserve officers came out of retirement. Merchant ship captains offered their vessels. Even civilian volunteers with no military training begged to be included. Commander Lisa Grant had been serving on the destroyer Vengeance for 3 years and had seen action during pirate suppression campaigns. When the call came, she volunteered immediately and was given command of the ship when her captain was reassigned to a larger vessel. Her new crew was a mix of veterans and volunteers who had never fired a weapon in combat. She drove them relentlessly through training exercises and drills until exhaustion became their normal state. They practiced attack runs and evasive maneuvers until the movements became instinctive. During a rare break, her tactical officer, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, sat with her in the mess hall. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of eager face that still believed in clear right and wrong. He told her that Richard Hayes had spoken at his academy graduation 3 years earlier. The ambassador had given a speech about how diplomacy was humanity's greatest strength, and how words could accomplish what weapons never could. Hayes had believed that understanding and communication could bridge any divide between species. Jake's voice cracked slightly as he said that they had killed a man who genuinely believed in peace, and who had spent his whole life trying to build it. Lisa had no answer that would make any of it make sense. She just nodded, and they sat in silence. Outside the viewport, stars moved past as the Vengeance joined the growing fleet. Ships arrived daily at the secret assembly point, far beyond any established trade routes. Warships and armed freighters and support vessels all gathering for a mission that might end in glory or disaster. The military designated it Operation Righteous Fury, but the crews simply called it the Reckoning. In 3 weeks, they would jump to the Draxian home system and show the Empire what happened when you murdered the wrong species. Diplomats, the human fleet, gathered at the edge of the Arcturus system where no trade routes passed and no sensors watched. 41 warships formed the core of the attack force, ranging from heavy cruisers to fast destroyers. 19 armed merchant vessels added their weapons to the count, though everyone knew their armor was thin and their chances of survival were poor. 8 support ships carried medical supplies, ammunition, and repair equipment. It was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled, but against the might of the Draxian Empire, it looked painfully small and inadequate. Admiral John Carter stood alone, on the bridge of the flagship Liberty, watching the tactical display as ships moved into formation. Each vessel represented hundreds of volunteers who had chosen to risk everything for a cause they believed in. He thought about Richard Hayes and the countless conversations they had shared over the years. Richard had always pushed for patience and understanding, even when dealing with hostile governments. The ambassador had believed that every conflict could be resolved through dialogue if both sides genuinely tried. Carter wondered what Richard would think of this fleet and this mission. Probably he would argue against it and insist there was still a diplomatic solution, but Richard was dead and diplomacy had failed in the most brutal way possible. Commander Lisa Grant's voice came through the communication channel from the Vengeance. She reported that all ships had checked in and crews were at their stations. Every captain had submitted final readiness reports and every system had been tested and retested. There was nothing left to prepare and nothing left to check. The fleet was as ready as it would ever be. Carter thanked her and opened a channel that reached every ship in the formation. His voice was calm and steady as he told them that in 1 hour, they would jump to the Draxian home system. What happened there would echo through history and define how the galaxy viewed humanity for generations to come. He paused and chose his next words carefully. Some of them might be wondering if this was right or if vengeance was worthy of humanity's better nature. He wanted them to understand that this was not about revenge. This was about making a declaration that human life had value, and that their people could not be murdered without facing consequences. It was about ensuring that other humans who traveled the stars would do so with some measure of safety. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity, though young among the stars, would not be made into victims. He ended by saying he was honored to serve with them, and that whatever happened in the coming hours, they had already proven humanity's courage. On the Vengeance, Lieutenant Jake Morrison checked his weapon systems for the 20th time. Everything showed green and ready, but he kept checking anyway because it gave his hand something to do. Around him, the bridge crew worked in focused silence. They had drilled these maneuvers hundreds of times in simulation, but everyone knew that reality would be different. Lieutenant Peter Allen from engineering asked if Jake was scared, and his voice was quiet enough that only those nearby could hear. Jake admitted he was terrified, but said he was more scared of what would happen if they did nothing. His sister wanted to join the diplomatic corps after finishing university. He wanted her to live in a galaxy where that career choice was not a death sentence. The final minutes counted down on displays throughout the fleet. In medical bays, doctors and nurses prepared equipment for casualties they hoped would not come. In engineering sections, technicians made final adjustments to reactors and drive systems. In crew quarters, soldiers recorded messages for families back home just in case they did not return. Some prayed to various gods while others sat in silence with their own thoughts. Fear was present in every heart, but so was determination and a sense of purpose that transcended individual survival. President Karen White watched from Earth, surrounded by her cabinet and military advisors. The command center was quiet except for the hum of computers and the occasional whispered conversation. The decision had been made and the die was cast. Now there was nothing to do but wait and hope that humanity's gamble would not result in extinction. Her chief of staff, Nathan Price, suggested quietly that there was still time to recall the fleet. She looked at him and shook her head. That time had ended when Emperor Vaxthor murdered Richard Hayes. Now they had to see this through regardless of the countdown reached 0, and space itself seemed to tear open as jump drives activated in careful sequence. One by one, the human ships vanished from normal space and hurled themselves across light years toward the heart of the Draxian Empire. The journey through jump space would take 6 hours. 6 hours of isolation, where ships traveled through a dimension that human science barely understood. 6 hours where there was nothing to do but think about what waited on the other side. Crews tried to rest, but few managed more than fitful dozing. The enormity of what they were about to attempt weighed on every mind. Admiral Carter spent those hours reviewing every piece of intelligence they had on Draxia Prime's defenses. The planet was protected by a ring of orbital weapons platforms, each one capable of destroying a capital ship. The Draxian defense fleet stationed there numbered 60 vessels, all of them larger and more heavily armed than human equivalents. Standard military doctrine said that attacking such a position required numerical superiority of at least 3 to 1. The human fleet was outnumbered and outgunned by any reasonable calculation. Their only advantages were surprise and desperation and the hope that new weapons technology would level the odds. Commander Daniel Rivers served as the Liberty's tactical officer, and he reminded the Admiral that their plan required perfect timing. If even one element failed, or if the coordination broke down, they would be destroyed before accomplishing anything meaningful. Carter acknowledged the risk, but said simply that failure was not acceptable. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. Dr. Martin Cole and his team had spent 5 years developing weapons that the galaxy had never seen. Now those weapons would be tested in the most demanding environment possible. The new technology represented humanity's best hope for victory. Railguns that accelerated projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed, giving them kinetic energy comparable to nuclear weapons. Fusion warheads with yields measured in gigatons, far more powerful than anything previously deployed. And most importantly, the Havoc missiles, which carried quantum disruptors, designed to interfere with shield generators. The theory was sound and testing had been promising, but none of it had been used in real combat against a real enemy. Carter knew that wars were not won by untested weapons, but by the courage of those who wielded them. The 6 hours passed slowly, and then suddenly they were gone. Alarms chimed throughout the fleet as ships began their emergence from jump space. The Liberty shuddered as it transitioned back to normal space at the very edge of the Draxian home system. One by one, the other vessels appeared in flashes of exotic radiation until the entire fleet had successfully made the jump. They had arrived far beyond the range of Draxian sensors, which gave them a brief window before they were detected. Carter studied the tactical display showing Draxia Prime as a blue dot, surrounded by defensive installations and patrol routes. He gave the order to advance, and the fleet began moving deeper into the system. They maintained communication silence and ran with minimal power signatures to delay detection as long as possible. Every minute they remained unnoticed was a minute closer to striking range. The ships moved in tight formation using gravitational shadows and background radiation to mask their approach. It was a desperate gambit that relied on Draxian overconfidence and the assumption that no one would dare attack their homeworld. On the Vengeance, Lisa Grant watched her sensor displays with growing tension. They were committed now with no possibility of retreat. If the Draxians detected them before they reached attack range, the fleet would be destroyed piecemeal as it tried to close the distance. If they reached attack range but the new weapons failed, then they would die accomplishing nothing. If everything went according to plan, they might actually survive and achieve their objective. The odds were not good, but they were better than accepting Richard Hayes's murder without response. The fleet continued its silent approach toward Draxia Prime. Ahead lay the most heavily defended planet in this region of space. Behind lay Earth and billions of humans who were counting on this mission to succeed. Around them was the cold vacuum of space that cared nothing for courage or justice. And within each ship were men and women who had volunteered to face impossible odds because some things mattered more than survival. They carried with them the fury of a young species that had been pushed too far and the determination to make the galaxy understand that humanity would not be trifled with. Carter checked the mission clock and saw they had 40 minutes before they reached the point of no return. After that, they would be detected and the battle would begin whether they were ready or not. He took a deep breath and prepared himself for what was coming. In less than an hour, they would either change the course of human history or die trying. There was no middle ground and no turning back. The reckoning had begun. The Draxian sensor station at the outer edge of their home system detected the anomaly first. Technician Corval had been monitoring deep space for 8 hours of his shift and nothing unusual had happened. Now his display showed energy signatures appearing from nowhere, dozens of them moving in-system at high velocity. He ran the scan 3 times thinking his equipment was malfunctioning, but the readings remained consistent. Ships were approaching Draxia Prime and they were coming fast. He triggered the emergency alert and forwarded all data to Planetary Defense Command. Supreme Commander Krathzek received the report in his command center deep beneath the palace. He studied the tactical display with growing confusion and then disbelief. The signatures matched human ship designs. Humans were approaching the Draxian throne world with what appeared to be their entire fleet. He had been present when Emperor Vaxthor executed their ambassador and had expected protests or perhaps trade sanctions. But this was beyond comprehension. These primitives were actually attacking the most heavily defended world in 40 systems. He demanded confirmation of the ship count. His sensor officer reported 68 vessels total with 41 matching military configurations. The rest appeared to be armed civilian ships. Krathzek's confusion shifted to something closer to contempt. 68 ships against the defenses of Draxia Prime was not a battle, but a massacre. These humans would learn a harsh lesson about challenging the Draxian Empire. He ordered the defense fleet to intercept positions and authorized the orbital weapons platforms to prepare for engagement. This would be over quickly. Admiral John Carter watched the Draxian vessels moving into formation on his tactical display. 60 warships arranging themselves in a defensive wall between the human fleet and the planet below. Their movements were precise and professional, showing confidence born of centuries of military dominance. They believed their superior numbers and firepower made victory inevitable. That confidence was about to become their greatest weakness. Carter opened the fleet channel and gave a single order: execute Apollo Protocol. The human fleet split into 3 groups with the maneuver executed so smoothly it looked rehearsed. The main force led by the Liberty accelerated directly toward the Draxian defensive line. Commander Lisa Grant took the second group, including the Vengeance, on a wide flanking trajectory that would bring them around the enemy's left side. The third group, consisting mostly of armed merchant ships, began what appeared to be a panicked retreat back toward the system edge. The Draxians responded exactly as predicted. 20 of their warships broke formation to pursue what they saw as easy prey, while the remaining 40 prepared to meet the frontal assault. Commander Daniel Rivers counted down the range on his display. 30 seconds until they entered effective weapons range for both sides. The Draxian ships were larger and their energy weapons had better reach. They would fire first and the humans would have to absorb that initial barrage. Carter ordered all ships to angle their strongest shields forward and to prepare for impact. Every crew member across the fleet braced themselves for what was coming. The Draxian ships opened fire and space lit up with energy beams. Bright lances of purple light crossed the distance in seconds and slammed into human shields. The destroyer Resolution took 3 direct hits. Its shields flared and buckled and collapsed. 2 more beams struck its hull and tore through armor like it was paper. The ship broke apart, spilling atmosphere and bodies into the void. 62 people died in less than 5 seconds. Carter felt each death like a punch to his chest, but kept his voice steady as he gave the next order. All human ships fired simultaneously. Railguns that had been charging during the approach released their deadly cargo. Tungsten rods, each weighing several tons, accelerated to 15% of light speed. The kinetic energy they carried was monstrous. When they struck Draxian shields, the impacts created brief suns as energy was converted to heat and light. The Draxian shields were designed to deflect or absorb energy weapons. They were far less effective against solid projectiles carrying relativistic momentum. A Draxian cruiser shuddered as 4 railgun rounds punched through its shields. The projectiles struck the hull and penetrated deep inside before their momentum was finally stopped. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as stored fuel and ammunition detonated. The cruiser broke in half and both sections tumbled away, trailing debris and frozen atmosphere. 2 more Draxian ships suffered similar fates in the first 10 seconds of engagement. But the real surprise was still coming. Carter ordered the release of the Havoc missiles. Every human ship launched them in coordinated salvos. The missiles were small and fast and carried no explosive warheads. Instead, each one held a quantum disruptor designed by Dr. Martin Cole's team. The technology created interference patterns that disrupted the exotic matter used in shield generators. It was completely theoretical until 3 months ago when testing proved it worked. Now hundreds of these missiles streaked toward the Draxian line. Draxian point defense systems engaged immediately. Laser grids and particle beams swept space, destroying incoming missiles by the dozens. But there were too many coming from too many angles. More than half the missiles got through the defensive fire and detonated within range of their targets. The quantum disruptors activated and released cascading waves of interference. Across the Draxian fleet, shield generators flickered and failed. In seconds, the defending warships went from protected to vulnerable. Daniel Rivers shouted that enemy shields were down. Carter immediately ordered all ships to concentrate fire. The human fleet had been designed around the assumption that they would face shielded opponents. Their weapons doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower to burn through defensive screens. Now those same weapons struck bare hulls with devastating results. Railgun rounds tore through armor like it was cloth. Fusion missiles vaporized entire sections of ships. Energy beams cut through hulls and ignited everything inside. Commander Lisa Grant brought her flanking force into the Draxian rear with perfect timing. The Vengeance and its accompanying ships attacked from an angle the enemy had left exposed. Lisa ordered her tactical officer, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, to target engines and propulsion systems. Cripple the enemy ships rather than destroying them outright. Jake coordinated the assault with the precision that came from endless drilling. Human ships moved in coordinated patterns, using their smaller size for greater agility. They were wolves attacking bears, using speed and teamwork against raw strength. The 20 Draxian ships that had chased the retreating merchant vessels suddenly found themselves in desperate trouble. The merchants reversed course and revealed weapons that had been hidden or disguised. Modified mining lasers that could burn through armor. Missile racks salvaged from decommissioned military ships. Improvised railguns built in colony workshops. Individually, the weapons were not impressive, but fired together they created a wall of destruction. The Draxian ships scattered, trying to avoid the unexpected assault. Supreme Commander Krathzek watched his tactical display with mounting horror. The battle that should have been a simple slaughter was turning into a nightmare. Human weapons were specifically designed to counter every Draxian advantage. Their tactics exploited weaknesses he had not known existed. Ships that had seemed inferior were fighting with coordination and ferocity that his forces could not match. He gave the order to recall all vessels to planetary defense and to activate the orbital weapons platforms. Perhaps those massive installations could turn the tide. The surviving Draxian warships pulled back toward the planet, trying to regroup under the protective fire of the orbital stations. Those installations were enormous structures built over centuries and armed with particle beams powerful enough to destroy capital ships. As the human fleet pursued the retreating Draxians, the platforms opened fire. Beams of concentrated energy swept through space like the fingers of an angry god. The human cruiser Defiance took a direct hit and simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, and the next it was expanding gas and debris. Carter had expected heavy losses from the platforms. They were the strongest element of Draxia Prime's defenses and could not be disabled by quantum disruptors. But he had planned for this as well. He ordered the fleet to execute attack pattern Carter 7. Every human ship dove toward the planet at maximum acceleration, using the gravity well to increase their velocity even further. They moved so fast that the orbital platform struggled to track them. Targeting systems designed for conventional ship speeds could not compensate for vessels moving at such extreme velocities. As the fleet whipped past the planet in a gravity-assisted slingshot maneuver, they released the final surprise. Kinetic kill vehicles were simple weapons with no guidance systems or warheads or shields. They were just chunks of depleted uranium wrapped around powerful rocket engines. The rockets accelerated them to velocities approaching 20% of light speed. When objects moving that fast hit anything, the results were catastrophic. The kinetic energy released was measured in megatons. The kill vehicles struck the orbital platforms with the force of nuclear weapons. Shields designed to stop sophisticated attacks proved completely useless against simple mass moving at relativistic speed. The first platform hit buckled in the middle and broke apart. The second exploded as its power core was breached. The third tumbled out of orbit, shedding pieces as it fell toward the planet below. Within seconds, half the platforms were destroyed or crippled. Debris rained down on Draxia Prime. Burning fragments streaked through the atmosphere like meteors, leaving trails of fire across the sky. On the surface, Emperor Vaxthor stood on his palace balcony watching the destruction overhead. Around him, Draxian citizens looked up in shock and terror. Fire fell from the sky. Their impregnable defenses burned. Ships exploded in orbit, casting flickering light across the planet. For the first time in 5,000 years, war had come to the Draxian throne world, and the species responsible was one he had dismissed as primitive and weak. The remaining Draxian warships tried to form a final defensive line, but they were scattered and demoralized. Their shields were still down and their numbers had been cut in half. The human fleet regrouped in PO or prepared for one more assault. Carter looked at his display showing the butcher's bill. 18 human ships destroyed. 3,000 crew members dead. But the Draxian defense fleet was broken, and their orbital platforms were ruins. He opened a channel to the planet and prepared to deliver humanity's terms. The battle was over, but the real test was just beginning. Admiral John Carter stood on the bridge of the Liberty, surrounded by the wreckage of what had been the Draxian home defense fleet. Burning debris floated in orbit around Draxia Prime, casting flickering shadows across his ship's hull. 18 human vessels had been destroyed in the battle, and over 3,000 crew members would never see Earth again. But the Draxian fleet that had seemed so mighty just hours ago now consisted of scattered survivors and drifting hulks. The orbital weapons platforms that had protected the throne world for millennia were shattered, ruins tumbling through space. Commander Daniel Rivers stood at the tactical station with his hand still gripping the console. He reported quietly that they had weapons lock on the Imperial Palace and could end this with a single strike. Carter looked at the planet below, spinning peacefully despite the carnage in orbit. Down there were billions of Draxian civilians who had nothing to do with Richard Hayes' murder. Children and families going about their lives unaware of the decisions being made above them. He thought about what Richard himself would say if he could see this moment. The ambassador had spent his entire career building bridges between species and seeking peaceful solutions. Carter ordered communications to open a channel to the planet on all frequencies. He wanted every Draxian to hear what he was about to say. The transmission went out across every wavelength, reaching every device and screen and communication system on Draxia Prime. In cities across the planet, Draxians looked up at their displays and saw the human admiral's face. His expression was hard but not cruel, and his voice carried the weight of terrible purpose. He identified himself and stated that 3 weeks ago, Emperor Vaxthor had murdered Ambassador Richard Hayes and Assistant Linda Morris during a diplomatic mission. They had come in peace, carrying proposals for mutual benefit. They had come unarmed and trusting in the protocols that governed relations between civilized species. They had come to build a better future for both their peoples. He paused and let the words settle. Emperor Vaxthor had believed that humanity would accept this atrocity without response. He had believed humans were too weak and too primitive to challenge the Draxian Empire. That belief had been a fatal mistake. On the planet, Emperor Vaxthor listened from his throne room, surrounded by the remnants of his guard. His forearms trembled with emotions he had rarely experienced in his long life. Rage at being challenged by these upstart humans, fear at what they might do next, and something else that felt almost like regret for underestimating them so catastrophically. Around him, advisors argued frantically about what to do, but their voices seemed distant and meaningless. Carter continued speaking, and his words were broadcast to every corner of Draxia Prime. He told them that the human fleet had destroyed their orbital defenses and crippled their military. By the ancient laws of war and the right of retribution, they could turn the planet into a graveyard. They could rain fire on cities and kill millions in revenge for 2 deaths. The power to do so was in his hands at this very moment. In shelters across the planet, Draxian civilians held their young and waited for the annihilation they were certain would come. The sky still glowed with falling debris from the destroyed stations. Then Carter said the words that shocked both species. He said they would not do it. Humanity would not slaughter civilians or commit genocide. They would not become the monsters that Vaxthor had believed them to be. Humans had come to the stars to explore and learn and trade. They had not come to conquer or to spread death. His voice carried conviction that reached across the void between species. But he made clear that this mercy came with conditions that were not negotiable. Emperor Vaxthor would surrender himself for trial. He would face justice for the murders he had ordered. The Draxian Empire would pay reparations to the families of Richard Hayes and Linda Morris. They would pay for the damage to human ships and the cost of this military operation. Most importantly, they would sign a treaty guaranteeing the safety of all human diplomats and travelers in perpetuity. Any future harm to human civilians would result in consequences far worse than what they had witnessed today. Carter leaned forward and his image filled screens across the planet. If the Emperor refused these terms, then humanity would not target civilians, but would systematically destroy every military installation in the Draxian Empire. Every shipyard and weapons facility and training base would be reduced to rubble. The Empire would be left defenseless in a galaxy full of rivals and enemies. The choice was Emperor Vaxthor's to make: justice or complete ruin. The transmission ended and silence fell across both fleets and both worlds. In the throne room, the Emperor sat motionless while advisors shouted conflicting counsel. Some urged continued resistance, saying that surrendering to humans would destroy Draxian prestige forever. Others insisted that further fighting would only bring more destruction. Supreme Commander Krathsek, who had watched the entire battle, stepped forward. The Emperor asked him directly if they could win. The commander's answer was immediate and definitive. They could not win. The humans had demonstrated weapons and tactics that the Draxians had no counter for. Their resolve was absolute, and their technology was more advanced than anyone had believed possible. Continuing the fight would result in exactly what the Admiral had promised. The Emperor's 4 arms sagged in defeat. 5,000 years of Draxian dominance had been shattered by a species that barely controlled its own star system. The irony was bitter but could not be denied. He ordered a channel open to Admiral Carter and said he would negotiate. The discussion that followed lasted 12 hours, with President Karen White participating from Earth via quantum link. The terms were harsh but not designed to destroy the Empire. Vaxthor would abdicate his throne and face trial for murder. The verdict would be determined by a panel of neutral alien judges. Reparations would be paid over 10 years in amounts the Empire could afford. The Draxian military would be reduced by half, and human observers would monitor compliance. Most importantly, a mutual defense pact would be established. Former enemies would become reluctant allies bound by treaty to protect each other. It was not friendship, but it was better than continued war. During the final session, President White spoke directly to the former Emperor. He asked why humanity would show mercy after everything that had happened. She looked at him through the holographic display and explained that Richard Hayes had believed in diplomacy and peaceful solutions. Linda Morris had died believing that understanding between species was possible. Humanity would honor their memory not by becoming murderers, but by building the future they had wanted to see. She leaned closer to the camera, and her voice became hard as steel. But this mercy came with a warning that every species in the galaxy needed to hear. Humanity would not be tested again. The next government that harmed human civilians would receive no negotiation and no terms. They would receive only fire and destruction until nothing remained. Earth was young among the stars, but would never again be seen as weak or vulnerable. That lesson had been written in blood and wreckage orbiting Draxia Prime. The treaty was signed aboard the Liberty with representatives from a dozen alien governments watching in amazement. The galaxy had expected the Draxians to crush the human fleet. Instead, they witnessed a young species bring an ancient empire to its knees through courage and innovation. The signing ceremony was brief and formal with no celebration. Admiral Carter and the former Emperor placed their marks on the document and then turned away from each other without speaking. Carter returned to the bridge and looked at the casualty reports one final time. 3,042 dead, 917 wounded, 18 ships destroyed and most of the surviving vessels damaged. The price had been steep, but the alternative would have been worse. Commander Daniel Rivers asked quietly what they had really accomplished. Carter thought about Richard Hayes and Linda Morris and all the humans who would travel the galaxy with more safety than before. He told his tactical officer that they had taught the galaxy a lesson about humanity. They had shown that humans valued peace but would fight when pushed. They had proven that human diplomats were not defenseless targets, and they had demonstrated that Earth, though young among the stars, would not be intimidated. But most importantly, they had shown themselves. They had proven that even in the fury of war, humanity could still choose mercy over revenge. That restraint in the face of overwhelming power was what separated them from species like the Draxians. The fleet jumped away from Draxia Prime, leaving behind a humbled empire and a galaxy that would never again underestimate the humans. In the how, years that followed the story spread across 1,000 worlds. How humanity had been pushed beyond endurance, how they had struck back with devastating force, and how they had still found the wisdom to choose justice over genocide. It became a tale that parents told children, and that diplomats referenced in negotiations. Earth had carved out its place among the stars with blood and courage and mercy. On Earth, a small ceremony was held for Richard Hayes, and Linda Morris, attended only by family and close friends. Their graves were marked with simple stones. Richard's inscription read that he sought peace among the stars. Linda said she believed in tomorrow. President Karen White placed flowers on both graves and stood in silence for a long time. The cost of peace had been paid in sacrifice, but it had been paid. Now came the harder work of making it last and ensuring their deaths meant something. As she walked away, she whispered to the wind and to the two souls who had given everything for humanity's future. She promised they would not be forgotten. She promised their sacrifice would have meaning. Above her, the stars shone down, indifferent and eternal. But among those stars, humanity had earned its place through strength tempered with wisdom. The galaxy had learned its lesson and would not forget.